Well, thank you, Jim, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I'm delighted to be here. In November 1977, at Manchester College in North Manchester, Indiana, the Kentucky farmer and writer, Wendell Berry, debated the former Secretary of Agriculture from the Nixon administration, Earl Butz. This was a fascinating debate in a number of respects, but most significant, I think, is the manner in which the conversation between these two men brings into focus starkly contrasting worldviews and understandings of the meaning of agriculture. Reading the debate, one encounters two individuals speaking entirely different languages. One speaks the language of industry, efficiency, technological progress, economic productivity, and above all, profit. The other speaks of values, beauty, community, memory, stewardship, and care. In reference to Berry's vision, Dr. Earl Butz stated, "I've got a feeling that Dr. Berry and I haven't met here tonight. Perhaps we won't." To which Berry later replied, "We may never meet," because he's arguing from quantities and I'm arguing from values. The title of the debate was "The Crisis of American Agriculture." Butz took issue with the title, arguing that he didn't like the word crisis and that, as far as he saw it, developments in American agriculture represented not so much a crisis, but a success story. Berry argued instead that in Henry County, Kentucky, where his family had been farming for 7 generations, things were changing and not for the good. There were fewer farmers and larger farms, and the new people farming were, as Berry put it, treating the farm exactly as you would treat a factory or a mine. Butz did not see this as a problem. In fact, he celebrated the new industrial type of farming. "I'm talking about modern, scientific, technological agriculture," he said. "It's big business, to be sure." Indeed, as Butz used to say when he was Secretary of Agriculture, farmers should plant fence row to fence row. They should get big or get out. During the debate, in reference to the declining family farm, Butz proposed a new formula, which he graciously offered to name after himself. In his words, "I've often thought that if I live long enough, that I'm going to adopt Butz's law of economics. It's a very simple one: adapt or die." Well, Wendell Berry has refused to adapt to Butz's law, and Berry's vision about the artistry of farming, the importance of membership in a local community, a sense of knowing and caring for a place, and a sort of reverence and awe for the created order, though clearly overshadowed by the dominant agribusiness model, has happily not died. In the debate, Berry argued that modern farming is governed by an ideal that is not agricultural, but industrial. It sees only a mechanical or industrial connection between the people and the land. "The ideal that I support," he stated, "sees the health of the land and the farming community, not production, as the primary concern." Well, how do we make sense of these contrasting visions? Well, today I'd like to offer a perspective on the topic by listening to several views of outsiders who visited our country at different times in history. As Jim mentioned, I wrote a book called "What They Saw in America," and it looks comparatively at observations of 4 foreign visitors who traveled to America at different times in history and from different countries, and then wrote about what they saw. All of them, in one form or another, discuss the topics of nature and agriculture. I will start with my second visitor, Max Weber, who came to the United States in 1904. Weber, one of the founders of the discipline of sociology, is best known for his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. He is less well known for his rather substantial research in the area of agriculture, which is unfortunate because it's important work. In fact, agriculture was the main focus of his early work that established him as a leading social scientist in Germany in the 19th century, the late 19th century. And moreover, the reason he came to the United States in 1904 was to give a lecture at the St. Louis World's Fair. And the topic of his lecture was a comparison between agricultural practices in Germany and in the United States. In the talk, he summarized some of the rather extensive research on agriculture in Germany, and the ways in which the forces of industrial capitalism were affecting farming practices in his home country, though in varying ways depending on a number of variables. However, when turning his comparative eye to the United States, he saw a very important general difference between German and American agriculture. According to Weber, in the United States, capitalism preceded farming rather than the other way around, as was the case in Europe. The American farmer, said Weber, produces for the market. The market is older than the producer here, whereas in Europe, the market is younger than the producer. This is, I think, an important insight. In the St. Louis lecture, Weber allowed that, historically, among some communities in America, approaches to the land were not exclusively understood as commercial enterprises. However, these cases were, according to Weber, by the time of his visit in 1904, no longer in existence. Instead, the dominant understanding of agriculture, as he put it, was the absolute individualism of the farmer's economics, the quality of the farmer as a mere businessman. Given the widespread influence of capitalism on farming in America, the only question to be asked, according to Weber, was whether and how the no longer existing rural community or society can arise anew so as to be strong and enduring. The purpose of Weber's long discussion about Germany in the St. Louis lecture was to underscore the historical and regional uniqueness of the American situation. The European peasant of the old type, said Weber, did not produce to gain profit, like a businessman. For the past 2,000 years, had not trained him to do this. Indeed, the two orientations highlighted by Max Weber ask very different questions of the land. As Weber put it, the old economic constitution asked, how can I give on this given soil work and sustenance to the greatest possible number of men? Capitalism asks, how can I produce as many crops as possible for the market from this given soil with as few men as possible? As I've mentioned, Weber's research on German agriculture was extensive. Where, though, did he get his information about American farming? It appears that he relied on several sources, including Hugo Munsterberg's book, The Americans, which was published the same year as Weber's visit. Now, Munsterberg was a German psychology professor who taught at Harvard University. He was a friend of William James's. And Munsterberg was also one of the organizers of the St. Louis World's Fair and had invited Weber to give his lecture. Well, in his book, The Americans, Munsterberg observed of Americans their reckless treatment of nature. The American farmers tilled only the best soil, wrote Munsterberg, and nature was dismantled and depleted in a way which a European who is accustomed to precaution finds positively sinful. He added that so far as nature is in question, Americans think very little of their children's children, but are greedy for instant profit. Another important source of input for Weber was a time he spent in Chicago, where he saw firsthand the sort of large-scale slaughtering practices made famous in Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. In fact, Upton Sinclair arrived in Chicago to begin his research for The Jungle just 1 month after Weber's time in Chicago. Weber's colorful descriptions of the city bear an uncanny resemblance to Sinclair's portrayal of Chicago and its famous slaughterhouses. Weber was clearly stunned by what he saw. He wrote of the ocean of blood, where several thousand cattle and pigs are slaughtered every day, of the unsuspecting bovine hoisted up by an iron grip and ushered through an assembly line of ever-new workers who eviscerate and skin it, etc., but always in the rhythm of work, tied to the machine that pulls the animal past them. One of Upton Sinclair's most important contacts in Chicago was a man named Adolph Smith, a British medical writer. Smith, though equally alarmed by what he saw in Chicago, differed from Sinclair in that he did not see socialism as the answer to the atrocities of the meatpacking industry. Instead, he put forth as an alternative model the more humane, healthful, and hygienic slaughterhouse practices of Europe. In fact, as Smith saw it, Chicago did not actually have slaughterhouses. Rather, it had large, unclean, and unsafe factories in which the wholesale and dangerous slaughtering of animals took place. The main difference highlighted by Smith was that in America, Unlike in Europe, animals were treated like any other industrial raw material, and the slaughtering process was approached according to the principles of modern industrialism. That is, as Smith put it, the sole object seems to be to convert each animal into a saleable product in the quickest and cheapest manner possible. Smith's assessment thus paralleled the comparison that Weber made in his St. Louis lecture between American and European agricultural practices more generally. Weber's comparative assessment thus revealed that Americans' treatment of the land was uniquely capitalist in orientation. And though he saw European practices moving in a similar direction, he also argued that in Europe, given its history and traditions, there was greater resistance to an exclusively or predominantly industrial orientation. And it should be noted that he saw one community in particular offering the greatest resistance. The farming communities that were thriving and, as he put it, gaining ground in East Prussia were not the native Protestant Germans, many of whom were abandoning farming altogether to move into the growing industrial cities, but the immigrant Catholic Polish farmers who were content to live in small villages and farm land viewed by others as less desirable. These Polish Catholic farmers, as Weber observed, were not producing for the market and thus were not vulnerable to the vagaries of the market, as they were farming to provide for the needs of their own community. These populations, incidentally, as noted in other scholarship of the time, were seen to be highly flourishing and thriving locally oriented communities. It was this comparative difference between the German Protestants and the Polish Catholics that represented the starting point for Weber's famous work, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. And again, it was in America that he saw this spirit most pronounced and evident in the country's agricultural practices. Okay, so some 70 years before Butz's time, Weber had detected an attitude, a disposition, a worldview that would become more pronounced and celebrated over time. How do Weber's comparisons, or how does his observations compare with what my other visitors observed? Well, let's go back even further in history to the time of Alexis de Tocqueville's visit. Tocqueville, who, along with his friend and traveling companion, Gustave de Beaumont, came to the United States in 1831, about 70 years before Weber's trip. Somewhat surprisingly, Tocqueville and Beaumont's observations on nature and agriculture in America line up in a number of respects with Weber's. First, Tocqueville and Beaumont were immediately struck by what they referred to as the mercantilist spirit in the United States. After being in the United States for only a week, Beaumont wrote to his father, "Americans are a mercantile people. They are consumed by a desire for riches." Both he and Tocqueville commented on this mercantilist orientation throughout their journey and saw it as a defining quality of Americans. In a letter to his sister-in-law, Tocqueville wrote of Americans' preference for commerce and occupations where they could earn more money. "There, in a nutshell," he wrote, "is the American character." The French visitors noticed this orientation influencing how Americans viewed nature and treated the land. In the second part of his celebrated work, Democracy in America, Tocqueville writes specifically about the orientation of the American farmer. He states, "Almost all the farmers in the United States have joined some commerce to agriculture. Most have made a commerce of agriculture." He added, "The American cultivator rarely settles forever on the soil he occupies. Instead, a field is cleared to be resold and not to be harvested." So just as Weber saw the market as having preceded the farmer in America, Tocqueville observed that Americans, in his words, transport the spirit of trade into agriculture, and their industrial passions show themselves there as elsewhere. Thus, an essentially mercantilist or business approach to farming was evident even as early as the 19th century America, long before the full realization of large-scale agribusiness practices. Just as Weber compared American farmers to farmers in Germany, Tocqueville and Beaumont offered comparisons between American and French-Canadian farmers, whom they also observed during their North American tour. Consider Beaumont's comparison between American farmers and the French-Canadian peasants, who incidentally were, like the Polish immigrant farmers observed by Weber, Catholic. This is what Beaumont said. Look at the French peasant with his gay humor, serene brow, and laughing lips, dancing joyfully in the village square. In America, they know nothing of this happy poverty. Absorbed by calculation, the American country dweller loses no time in pleasures. The fields say nothing to his heart, and the sun that brings fertility to his hillsides doesn't warm his soul. He treats the land as industrial material and lives in his cottage as if in a factory. Notice that that is precisely the language that Wendell Berry used in his debate with Earl Butz to describe new agricultural practices in the United States. That is, they treat their farm as if it were a factory. Tocqueville also noticed, as he put it, that the French Canadians were tenderly attached to the land which saw his birth, to his church, town, and to his family. Like the Polish immigrant farmers observed by Weber, the French Canadians were content with less fertile land and lacked the acquisitive spirit to pursue a more lucrative life elsewhere. At one point, Tocqueville even asked a French Canadian farmer why Canadians were content with small fields when fertile but uncultivated land was to be found 20 leagues away. The response, noted Tocqueville, came with a certain bite, as the peasant replied, "Why do you love your wife when your neighbor's wife has much more beautiful eyes?" One's tempted to reflect on Wendell Berry's discussions of husbandry in this context. Yeah. Tocqueville observed that in contrast, Americans were much more restless and more mobile. He saw restlessness as one of the distinctive character traits of the American people, one which manifested itself in several ways, including in the inclination among Americans to perpetually relocate. Unlike the Canadian farmers, the American pioneer never stayed in one place for long. He carefully builds a dwelling, wrote Tocqueville, and then sells it while the roof is being laid. He settles in a place from which he departs soon after, so as to take his changing desires elsewhere. Tocqueville and Beaumont even learned of an Illinois woman whose 12 children had each been born in a different home. The novelist Wallace Stegner, Wendell Berry's teacher at Stanford University, makes a distinction between what he calls boomers and stickers. In Stegner's terms, Tocqueville found Americans to be boomers and the French Canadians to be stickers, the latter an approach to life characterized by contentedness, stability, care, and an affectionate sense of place. Okay, so on to the third of the visitors that I will talk about today, namely G.K. Chesterton. Like both Weber and Tocqueville, Chesterton discussed America's farming communities. In fact, he saw these as among the very best things about American society. At first glance, he seems more optimistic than Weber about the durability and vitality of rural America. Chesterton made 2 visits to America, one in 1921 and then a second one in 1930 and extended into 1931. He wrote after his first visit, "Farms will last and farming will always last." Recall how, in contrast, Weber stated that in the United States, there no longer existed what might be called rural society. Chesterton held to the Jeffersonian vision of a democratic society populated by small family farms, close to the land, and with farmers and townspeople producing their own locally unique culture, including agriculture. Thus, he was heartened by what he witnessed in terms of the continuing vitality of America's small towns and small farms. They represented a small-scale democratic societal arrangement that would serve as a counterweight to the destructive spread of industrialism. As he put it in his second book on America, he said, "The modern agricultural life in America is still the only real life there is. It is especially all that remains of the real popular life. Exactly insofar as men are villagers, men are Democrats. Insofar as they still live in villages, they are citizens. Citizenship has vanished from the cities. Insofar as America retains certain rural truths and traditions, it is exactly by those that they may yet survive and succeed." Chesterton didn't like American cultural imperialism and felt that the British imported all the wrong things from America. He didn't like America's large department stores. And he didn't like America's large, impersonal, and uniform hotels, but he did like America's small-town farmers. In his first book on America, Chesterton farcically proposed that the English should import a Nebraska farmer and set his farm down in the middle of London for observation. An ideal spot, he thought, would be the space occupied by Selfridge, the enormous department store on Oxford Street in London designed by the Chicago businessman Gordon Selfridge. He argued that it could be easily cleared away for the purpose. The small farm thus situated, Londoners could learn a great deal of good by watching the Nebraska farmer at his work and might come to realize that a man can really live and walk about upon something more productive than a pavement, and that when he does so, he can really be a free man. Chesterton believed that the agrarian-based small-town life could save America from the calamities of wealth and science. On this point, Chesterton's wish or prediction would clearly not be realized. Between 1920 and 2010, the number of farms in the United States decreased from over 6.4 million to about 2.2 million. In 1900, 40% of the American labor force was employed in agriculture. By 2000, this had decreased to less than 2%. Following Butts's prescription to get big or get out, the number of acres per farm increased during the 20th century from an average of 150 acres per farm in 1900 to an average of 460 acres in 2000. Little could Chesterton have imagined the steady and rapid disappearance of this family farm that would ensue in the next 80+ years. Instead, a small-scale agriculture checking the spread of industrialism, instead of that, Chesterton anticipated, or at least hoped, industrial capitalism turned farming itself into large-scale agribusiness. That is, he hoped for the small farm to check the expansion of industrialism, and instead, we've seen the way in which industrial capitalism has turned farming into large-scale agribusiness. It would be wrong, however, to conclude that Chesterton was entirely blind to this eventual outcome. To the contrary, he noticed that in places like Oklahoma, the small towns did not develop their own local culture, but imported culture from the cities via the cinema and the railroads. While Chesterton would have wished for small-town Oklahomans to produce their own cultural products, he saw the infusion of the city culture as importing, as he put it, a blast of death and a reek of rotting things. Moreover, Chesterton even seems to have anticipated the triumph of industrialism over small-scale farming and worried that the ruralism in America was not really rural. Instead, the utilitarian mindset imported from the industrialized cities had already infected agrarian life, such that the farm was not, as he put it, treated so much as a farm to feed people, but as a shop from which to sell food. Thus, he detected a mindset that would eventually lead to the situation we have today, in which food is not always the primary item sold in the so-called farm as shop. Of the more than 90 million acres of corn, for example, grown in the United States each year, less than 2% is for direct human consumption. The vast majority, over 70%, is now used for biofuels and large animal feedlots. Chesterton, like Tocqueville and Weber before him, thus detected a utilitarian understanding of the land in America. Chesterton observed that when referring to the rule, men are not talking about the land, they're talking about real estate. In sum, then, all three visitors, along with their traveling companions, identified similar qualities about Americans' approach to nature and to agricultural production. They found that a mercantilist or capitalist mentality heavily colored the manner in which Americans approached the land and contemplated their natural surroundings. Thus, one finds that the ideals expressed by Earl Butts during his reign as Secretary of Agriculture and in his 1977 debate with Wendell Berry have not only triumphed, but that these ideas are not as new and revolutionary as is often imagined. Butts himself seemed to understand this. Nearly 2 decades before his debate with Berry, when he was Dean of Agriculture at Purdue University, he was already promoting and celebrating the industrial farm. The trend toward larger and fewer commercial farm units will continue, he said. Machines will continue to displace men on farms. We will produce more with fewer and fewer workers than at present. But then he said something that our foreign visitors have confirmed. He said, this is not a new trend. It has been going on for decades. It has only accelerated in the present decade, and it will continue still more in the decade ahead. To use an ironic and thus somewhat tragic metaphor, one could say that a utilitarian and industrial attitude toward farming has deep roots in the soil of American agricultural practices. That said, recent developments give us reason to believe that Butts's vision, while clearly the dominant model today, does not represent the whole or even the final chapter in the story of American agriculture. In the United States, there has been, in recent years, renewed and growing interest in local, organic, small-scale practices. Increasingly popular are such developments as the slow food movement, farm-to-table restaurants, farmers markets, locavore practices, and CSA farms. The first American CSA farm was started in Western Massachusetts in 1985, not too far from where I live. Now there are more than 7,500 CSA farms throughout the United States. Such documentaries as Food Inc., King Corn, and Fresh, as well as Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma, and the writings of Wendell Berry and Joel Salatin have done much to make Americans more aware of the magnitude and consequences of agribusiness in the United States. Nevertheless, these are still minority voices. What is sometimes not realized, even among advocates of these movements, is just how pervasive and entrenched an essential business mindset has been to agriculture throughout American history, a reality made evident by the views of the visitors who came to America. All right, in closing, let me return to Wendell Berry, but this time I want to put him in conversation with a very different interlocutor, not Earl Butts, but Pope Francis. This time we find a lot more common ground. In fact, a very similar vision. As the classicist William Fahey puts it, however they got there, the Bishop of Rome and the solitary sage of Henry County have been drinking from the same well. So let me briefly highlight what I see as several areas of common ground expressed in their writings, and in particular, Pope Francis's Laudato Si. First, both Pope Francis and Wendell Berry speak of nature, agriculture, and the role of the farmer as an integrated part of a greater whole. That is, as Pope Francis puts it in Laudato Si, everything is connected. Everything in the world is connected. Berry describes quite eloquently the vital and integrated role of the farmer in his debate with Earl Butts. Listen to what he said. He said, as I see it, the farmer standing in his field is not simply a component of a production machine. He stands where lots of cultural lines cross. The traditional farmer, that is the farmer who first fed himself off his farm and then fed other people, who farmed with his family, who passed the land on down to people who knew it and had the best reasons to take care of it. That farmer stood at the convergence of traditional values, our values, independence, thrift, stewardship, private property, political liberties, family, marriage, parenthood, neighborhood. Values that decline as the farmer is replaced by a technologist whose only standard is efficiency. Second, both Berry and Pope Francis place emphasis on the importance of the local. This was also something that Chesterton repeatedly emphasized in his admiration of the small farm and rural life in America. It's an emphasis in keeping with the subsidiarity principle in Catholic social teaching, something reaffirmed by Pope Francis in Laudato Si, and with the notion of distributism promoted in Chesterton's writings. Consider some of Berry's prescriptions on this point. He says, always ask how local needs might be supplied from local sources, including the mutual help of neighbors. Always supply local needs first, and only then think of exporting their products, first to nearby cities and then to others. Make sure that money paid in the local economy circulates within the community as long as possible before it is paid out. Okay, the emphasis on the local. Third, both talk of resisting a technological paradigm and of recovering a sense of wonder, reverence, and awe toward creation. Pope Francis writes critically about a dominant technological paradigm. He notes that technology is not neutral and that it conditions our lifestyles in such a way as to encourage a kind of technological reductionism, that affects every aspect of our lives. It takes over, or as he put it, technology tends to absorb everything into its ironclad logic. Wendell Berry, of course, has written quite a bit about the dangers of technology and of a technological mindset on family, farming, and community life. Fourth, both speak about the importance of place, of loving a place, of cultivating a memory about a place, in Wallace Stegner's terms of being affectionate stickers rather than restless boomers. As Pope Francis writes, the entire material universe speaks of God's love, his boundless affection for us. Soil, water, mountains, everything is as it were a caress of God. The history of our friendship with God is always linked to particular places which take on an intensely personal meaning. This, I would add, is especially the case with farmers, whose unique calling places them very close to the rhythms of the natural order of life. Thomas Jefferson recognized this unique and special calling. In his notes on the state of Virginia, he wrote, "Those who labor in the earth are the chosen people of God, if ever he had a chosen people, whose breasts he has made his peculiar deposit for substantial and genuine virtue." Or, as it says in the book of Sirach, "Hate not laborious tasks, nor farming, which was ordained by the Most High." Finally, both speak in a sense about the importance of imagination and affection. Berry writes of the importance of imagination in cultivating a proper attitude and way of thinking about the environment. As he puts it, by imagination, we recognize with sympathy the fellow members, human and non-human, with whom we share our place. And I would add to that as Catholics, our attitude toward the land and toward the created order more generally should reflect, in particular, a distinctively Eucharistic imagination. Indeed, in the liturgy of the Eucharist, in every Mass, the priest says, "Blessed are you, Lord God of all creation, for through your goodness we have received the bread we offer you, fruit of the earth and work of human hands." Those are wonderful words, and I love them. Fruit of the earth and work of human hands. Fruit of the vine and work of human hands. Is this not the essence of the vocation of the farmer? And understood as such, it is the only lay vocation given such exalted status in the Eucharistic prayers of the Mass. Thus, we bring from the earth the fruits of our labors, and we offer them back to God. And that which we offer becomes what we know to be the source and summit of our faith, that is, in all of its mystery, the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Or as the priest says next in this part of the liturgy, it will become for us the bread of life. In other words, within the framework of a Eucharistic imagination, we see a close relationship between what happens in the Mass and what happens in the field. We participate in and are stewards of God's created order. Pope Francis makes this connection in Laudato Si, in which he writes, "The Eucharist embraces and celebrates all creation. It is a source of light and motivation for our concerns for the environment, directing us to be stewards of all creation." And as Deacon Kent Ferris said earlier, Pope John Paul II made a similar sort of association. In his Pope John Paul II's 2003 encyclical on the Eucharist, he likewise spoke of the cosmic character of the Eucharist. Yes, cosmic, he said, because even when it is celebrated on the humble altar of a country church, the Eucharist is always, in some way, celebrated on the altar of the world. It unites heaven and earth. It embraces and permeates all creation. Thus, the Eucharist, and concomitantly, a Eucharistic imagination, transforms the way we think about farming, about our rural community, about the land, about nature. We approach creation with reverence, as good stewards, as collaborators working within its limits, and importantly, with affection. In 2012, Wendell Berry gave the annual Jefferson Lecture at the Kennedy Center, and the title of his talk was, "It All Turns on Affection." His ideal of affection stands in direct opposition to the industrial and technological mindset of exploitation and extraction. Affection, says Berry, is properly directed toward that which is true, just, and beautiful. He adds, "A large machine and a large toxic eroded cornfield is not, properly speaking, an object or a sign of affection." Interestingly, C.S. Lewis also talks about affection in his book, The Four Loves. In fact, it is the first of the four loves that he discusses in the book. For Lewis, as with Barry, affection has the quality of familiarity and is directed toward humans and non-humans, or as Lewis puts it, subhumans. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis identified affection as the posture toward creation embodied in the life of St. Francis of Assisi, who viewed each and every creature united to him by bonds of affection. To approach creation with affection is to care for it, to be familiar with it, to respect its limits, its seasons, its rhythms, and to recognize it as a gift which we receive, cooperate with, and then offer back to God. Thus, on this 100th anniversary of Catholic rural life, we have a wonderful opportunity in a time when the land, farms, and rural communities have been harmed by practices and ways of thinking that have persisted in American society for many years. We can renew our commitment to think and act differently. Catholic rural life is in a unique position to make an important contribution with its impressive legacy, its exceptional leadership, for which I have both admiration and affection, and most importantly, its theologically informed worldview. Motivated by affection and animated by a Eucharistic imagination, we can answer with determined hope the important question posed by Max Weber back in 1904 of whether and how the no longer existing rural community or society can arise anew so as to be strong and enduring. Thank you.